So we're going to start with speaking to other Christians about climate change, which is study number 5. And the basic question of this is, what are the ways in which we engage in climate change debate and gently point people to Jesus? Come here, and I go back to number 5. You can see the titles as I go through, perhaps. All right.
I want to offer 4 specific thoughts for having these conversations. And the first one is this: do not engage out of guilt. Because one of the hallmarks of what we believe is that we have been freed from that guilt. We act from the heart because we've been given new hearts that want to do what's right. That we don't just live in fear of punishment from God, we live in the hope and the freedom that Christ's sacrifice brought us. As it says in Romans 8, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because we don't walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And in Hebrews 10, it talks about how the sacrifices under the law were not able to free people from guilt for their sins because it was not able to make them perfect. But, as it continues on in the chapter, it says, by one sacrifice, Christ did make us perfect. All of those who are being sanctified in our behavior. Doesn't mean our behavior is perfect. We all know that's not true. But it does mean that we have been freed from the price of sin, because the price of sin was death. Christ paid it, and that means that we can walk in newness of life. So motivating people out of guilt is not what we have to do. I still remember one of the very first round tables I went to that had Christian leaders from many different denominations, Protestant, Catholic, and more. And as we were sitting there at that table with most people who had flown to that location, and as we all know, flying is one of the most carbon-intensive ways we can transport ourselves around the world, one person leaned across the table. He said, you know, every time you turn on your car, you're sinning. I thought to myself, oh, so when I go to church, I'm sinning. Coming to this meeting was sinning. Going to my job is sinning. Taking my child to the doctor if they're sick is sinning. I just wanted to go out to the parking lot, find the nearest Hummer. This meeting happened in Texas, so I imagine there would have been a Hummer nearby. Find the nearest Hummer and just drive circles around and going, sinning, I'm sinning. Guilt is not how we are intended to be motivated, and God knows this, and that's why we have been freed from guilt by Christ's sacrifice. And so the first thing we need to do is not pass that guilt on, but rather acknowledge that we are free, and because we are free, we can choose to do the right thing. And how do we choose? That brings me to my second point: not out of fear. I love this verse from Timothy because it provides a litmus test. So much of our conversation about climate change, whether we fear the unchecked impacts of climate change or whether we fear the solutions of climate change, so much of that conversation revolves around fear. Yet in Timothy, the Apostle Paul tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear. So if we are feeling fear, that fear is not coming from God. Instead, God has given us power, and this is very important. It's not a word we use very often, but we do use a derivative of it, which is empowered. Empowered means we are capable of acting, and fear, on the other hand, can spark a short-term reaction, but long-term fear and anxiety will paralyze us. So being empowered, having the spirit of power, means that rather than being paralyzed by fear, we are able to act. How? Out of love, having compassion for others, caring for their needs, and, I love this last one, with a sound mind. Using the sound mind that God gave us to make good decisions based on the information that we see in His creation. So how do we have conversations with fellow Christ followers? Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but number 3, in love. We are to be recognized by our love for others, and we are told to walk in love just as Christ loved us and gave Himself for us. Walking in love, and lastly, in hope too. Over the last 2 years, I would say that the most frequent question that I've gotten from anywhere, in any group, in any organization I've spoken to, young or old, Christian or secular, North America or European, the most frequent question I've got is, what gives you hope? And as Christians, we know that hope comes from a very counterintuitive place. In the book of Romans, Paul writes that we know that troubles help us learn not to give up. So he begins with troubles. Troubles help us learn not to give up. When we have learned not to give up, it shows that we have stood the test. When we have stood the test, it gives us hope. And hope never makes us ashamed, or another translation would say it never disappoints, because the love of God has come into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. So we have hope. Not guilt, not fear. Love, hope, and a sound mind are how we can engage with each other. And these are the values and the gifts from God, really, that we can connect with in others and inspire with others.
All right. John, would you read that again about hope? That's Romans. She did 4, 5. Would you do 3 through 5, please?
And not only that we boast in our sufferings, knowing the endurances produces inheritance, and the endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And so hope does not disappoint us, for God love has been poured in our hearts as the Holy Spirit has been given to us.
Thank you. So I guess one of the big questions is, how does hope inspire us with how we're to address climate change as Christians? Is all lost?
Well, for me, hope comes with a feeling of efficacy, like there's something that we can do. To me, those are intertwined. And so it's, I guess the challenge is to think what we can do. For me, that's the challenge.
Do you think that that's a good way to approach people, or is guilt and fear a more, a better hammer?
Intimidation is good.
Yes.
You have to be able to pull it off.
Yeah.
Me, guilt and fear are paralyzing.
I do too. I do too.
Back in the School of Education, we were taught pretty much not to use guilt and scare tactics in teaching about controversial stuff with kids. But I think that's kind of what she's saying.
Yeah, I think the human being is very good at turning people off because it's so painful. You just like, I can't handle this, so I'm going to stop listening to you.
I think they've done studies that have shown that it just doesn't work. This is more, again, with kids maybe, but trying to change behavior with threats, fear, intimidation, you name it, that's negative, probably just is not going to work.
I think it works if people try to control you by making you fear others. That seems to work very effectively. But fear of your own actions or what you can do, yeah, I think that's true.
Then you can start getting defensive, then you don't hear anything.
That's true, yeah. And with climate change, I think they've had 30 years of getting defensive, because we've been talking about it.
And I keep thinking of what she said last week, which was, or you said, the solutions don't necessarily have to be painful or unpleasant.
Yeah.
It can be really good things.
Yeah.
Well, and most of the discussion has been about sort of what's happening and its implication, but not about the solutions. And we hear about carbon footprint, but that in itself is abstract. And it's like, well, why? If I do it, my neighbor isn't, why? But, there's other things we can do, public policy wise.
Yes, in fact, the first week she brought up, or maybe it's the book I was reading of hers, she brings up the fact that so few companies are producing so much of the emissions, right? And she said one thing that Shell did, which was very smart, was come up with this carbon footprint thing for personal guilt.
Mhm.
Because, and then she did all these statistics of it, and if every person who thought that climate change was a concern cut their carbon footprint in half, it would amount to 6 to 10% reduction, which is a drop in the bucket compared to.
So personal behavior and personal effect on the whole issue is far less than this handful of industrial.
Yes, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Right.
Right, I think that it,
Right.
I think inaction makes you feel very bad. And I think if everybody did it, it's still 6 to 10%, which is not insignificant. But more so, you say changing public policy, or I think that is, or working as a church too, is very powerful. So, yeah. All right. All right, let's do that next guy.
I live in Texas, and Texas is unique for many reasons. It is the most vulnerable state in the United States to the impacts of a changing climate. It is the center of oil and gas production in the United States and one of the top centers in the world. It is also a place where many people reject the truth of what God's creation is telling us. But it's also a place, I believe, where we can make some of the biggest difference. So what is it like in Texas? Well, one of our state senators a few years ago said this: climate change is not science, it's religion. And Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina agreed. He said the problem is Al Gore. He's the one who turned it into a religion. When people are saying this, what are they doing? They are very deliberately trying to cast climate change as an alternate religion. Why? Because the vast majority of us already have a religion that we're very happy with, over 80% of us around the world. And if this is cast as a false religion, as an earth-worshiping religion, as a pagan religion, if it's cast as a religion, then the majority of us who are true believers will reject it. So that is what this messaging is trying to accomplish. Unfortunately, when this type of messaging first started to circulate a number of decades ago, people said, oh, well, if that's the case, all we need to do is have religious leaders tell people the truth, and that people will change their minds. Because, of course, we know that the Pope released an encyclical back in 2015 that talked all about climate change, about how global warming is being caused by the enormous consumption of the wealthiest nations with repercussions in the poorest places of the planet. So what impact did the Pope's encyclical have on public opinion in the United States? Well, I have a colleague, her name is Ashley Landrum, and she studies this. She found that rather than changing people's opinions about climate change in the United States, she specifically only studied people in the US, she found that it changed people's opinions about the Pope. If Christians, either Catholic or Protestant, already agreed with the Pope about climate change, they thought more of the Pope. However, if they didn't agree with the Pope, their opinion of the Pope went down. Yes. Isn't that shocking? So how do we have conversations in difficult situations, as I often find myself in here in Texas? The only way to have that constructive conversation is to connect over something that we truly share. And here's the thing. Number one, sometimes it doesn't exist. We just can't find anything. And if that's the case, we're not the person to have the conversation. I was asked to address the board of an oil and gas company. And again, my rule is if I can't figure out how to connect, I'm not going to do it. I'm not the right person to have the conversation. So I wasn't quite sure what to do. I sat on the request for a while. I said, let me think about it. I prayed about it. And then suddenly one day it came to me. I am profoundly grateful for fossil fuels. If we were living back 300 or 400 years ago, our lifespan would have been half what it was today. The average lifespan in the UK back in the early 1800s was 40 years, and now it's 80 years. As a woman, my life would have been endless drudgery, taking all day to do the laundry back in the days when people only had 2 or 3 outfits to begin with. Going to find water, cooking food, growing food, cleaning up after the food. Not only that, But fossil fuels and industrialization were a huge part of what enabled us to eliminate slavery, first of all in the British Empire and later even in the Civil War in the United States. It enabled us to free ourselves of enormous amounts of human labor, of female labor, of child labor, of animal labor, and most importantly, of slave labor. When I think about the simple benefits of electricity, transportation, refrigeration, being able to see the world, being able to interact with people right now as we are today, all of these benefits have been brought to us by fossil fuels. Just because I'm grateful for fossil fuels, though, doesn't mean that I still want to use them in the future. We're grateful for buggies and horses, but when the Model T Ford came along, people recognized that was the better way. We were grateful for party line telephones back in the day, and I even had one as a child. But now that we have cell phones, we're grateful for those. I still remember when my husband actually gave me my first iPhone for Christmas, I think one year. And I remember thinking to myself, what a terrible present. I never asked for this. I didn't want it. Why would he give this to me? Turns out he knew what he was doing. So I am profoundly grateful for what has brought us to this place. But at the same time, I recognize that while we still need energy in the future, there's a different way to get it. So I decided to accept. I went in and I started by saying simply that I was grateful that they provided an essential service to people, that many of the poorest places in the world did not have access to energy, and that was enhancing their poverty, that we needed energy today more than ever, but the question is, how are we going to get it in the future? And that completely changed the conversation. I was scheduled to talk to them for maybe, 30, 40 minutes. It ended up going for 2 hours. And they said, you get it, you understand what we're doing. We provide jobs for people, we provide industry in some areas where otherwise there wouldn't be much. We provide the essential energy that people need, and we try to do so in a way to be good stewards. In fact, they said, we've empowered our operations out in West Texas with wind energy. I didn't even know that. They hadn't really been blowing their own horn on that. So that was a time when, because we were able to connect, we were able to have an incredible conversation.
I love that one.
Yeah.
How do you guys feel about climate change campaigners? Do they turn you off? They,
Depends on their approach, I guess.
yeah,
You know,
good.
It really does. So, like, back to the first clip, it's like when people start throwing guilt and shame and, that sort of thing around, then it doesn't go over well with me. And most people like it.
There's also anybody who talks about that has to be solutions oriented enough to be able to bridge the gap between where we are and where we need to be, without their impression of where we need to be being back in the Stone Age. Because I think that's where you lose a lot of people on this. Okay, what does it mean not using my car? That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about alternative energy, wind and solar and stuff of that nature, electric vehicles. Obviously, it doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of infrastructure consideration, but this is something that takes time. And anyone who just says, well, we got to stop right now and wants us to do everything we possibly can is a scary prospect, because policy doesn't emerge overnight.
I think people see this as way down the road somewhere. It's not going to affect me. No, but it's, well, what about your grandkids? Oh, it's going to take centuries. I don't think they see the immediate concern that it's something far off.
How many people do you think associated the forest fires with this? We've had incredible forest fires the last couple of years.
I don't think many.
Yeah, I think there are some that are. I think that's part of what's starting to change opinion. But I think probably the biggest thing, it isn't so much that Florida is going to lose real estate, which is unfortunate. They talk about climate refugees, but I think it's food production.
Yeah.
When we start experiencing crop failure is when people are going to really wake up, hopefully not too late, to see that this is deadly serious.
Are there agencies now who are discussing different plants, things that can have more drought resistance, corn and wheat? I think that they are, people making decisions are very well. I think we've talked about even the Pentagon has been planning for this for 30 years. seeing it as refugees,
Right.
political instability. And
I think the food problem's already there in some places, just not the US. At least it's not visible in the US yet, but in some other places.
is anybody from California? You know, I mean, you probably watch it better than we do. They're having trouble with climate change and their crops there now, aren't they?
Lengthy drought.
Oh, that's right.
But it used to be when I would go down the Central Valley to Bakersfield where I was. There were a variety of crops on either side of the highway, and now it's corn. And I'm thinking it's ethanol production.
Oh,
And the irony about corn, the petroleum inputs alone makes it a
Right,
wash
yeah.
or actually a deficit it's actually producing more greenhouse gas emissions than just sticking with straight petroleum. Now, it's a great concept, but let's switch it over now to something that doesn't require those petroleum inputs to make it a net benefit.
I think it was a political decision when they started adding ethanol to gasoline.
I think it was.
what about rice? Are they still growing rice down there?
In the Sacramento Delta area, yeah, and so there's flooding, there are different things that happen there too.
That's an incredibly water intensive
Yeah.
crop, isn't it?
It is. I mean, some
That's
crops
absurd.
like tomatoes don't take very much water. Rice takes a lot of
Yeah.
water.
The other one was almonds. That they have the largest almond crop in the world, and that takes incredible amount of water.
And it's grown in Modesto area, which gets maybe 12 inches of rain a year or something.
That's arid. That's a desert.
Right, but that was one of those things that actually was addressed in kind of an unfortunate way in terms of doing that, but it didn't need to take a lot of water, it was just the way they did it.
Mm.
So, I mean, when the
Oh.
water became scarce, I mean, a lot of people sold their almond farms to nasty people on Wall Street who figured out that all you had to do was invest in drip irrigation. And you needed 1/10 the amount of water, because they were just sprinkling in the
Oh.
desert to try to keep the trees wet. And they installed drip insulation and it works. But you had to have the money to invest in it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Make it work. That's one of the things there was a solution. Yeah, you hate to see a bunch of family farmers selling off to Wall Street so they could. Desired effect.
And then take that situation, the consolidation of food production under fewer and fewer larger conglomerates, and interject climate change and the increased costs that it will take to be able to keep pace with that. And at some point, it's a business decision to say, liquidate, we're done. Then what? Then where do our carrots come from? Where do our potatoes, where does our corn come from at that
But now
point?
we're in the fear.
Yep. Maybe.
Well, it's economically, socioeconomically driven, and it's all part of the same.
I know. And you're stating
Hi.
factual things, but it's not solution focused for me.
I think what Nancy
True.
was saying too is that people don't see it as in the near future. So maybe you can sneak a few facts in there to get their attention,
Mhm.
not necessarily fear. Don't leave them in fear, leave them in hope. And so can you think of hopeful ways or ways that we connect with other Christians that make them feel positive about participating personally as a church nationally?
Can you ask that question again? please?
Sure. How do you, you're talking to somebody that you want to build a connection with so that you feel a conversation will be fruitful. You don't hit them with fear. You don't hit them with guilt. As she says, that's from the Bible. That is not the way to live a life. So you reach them positively with hope. And so you want to move on. What kind of things can you connect with? What kind of things would you tell people that they can be hopeful about in our addressing climate change as individuals, churches, as a country? You mentioned some of them. Electric vehicles are coming on. I can't think of any planning or development group across the country, I've not been in Texas, that doesn't have climate change in their bag. They have to think about whether it's less water or where we're gonna get the water. You all saw that article, right? Where it said the glaciers will be gone in 70 years. We were down in Peru and it had already happened. And so these huge rivers that were teeming with water, we were supposed to do whitewater rafting. Because we were tourists and we were walking Machu Picchu Trail. And the water, remember, it was dribbling. And the guy said, we don't know where we're gonna get our water. They couldn't call somebody at the, at the government level and say, we're in trouble. They were just trying to figure out where to put the wells.
There's a lot to overcome, and it depends on where the specific people are on the issue. Some of them probably are aware of it, and therefore it's like she said, just come up with the common ground. But then there's those who, no, I don't believe it. They've been watching, they have their news sources that reinforce that it's not really an issue, that scientists don't agree, which I don't happen to believe is true. So even as the starting point, as agreement that there is a problem to worry about, that to me is, I almost kind of view that as it's a no starter. I would be incredibly frustrated and am from time to time when I encounter folks like that. The other side of it, and as a Christian, you may have folks that say, well, I just know that Jesus is coming and he'll take care of it, which is a true statement. And I guess, and to me in that response, well, since we're the body of Christ, we're his hands on this earth. Why don't we start doing something about it and start his work early so he doesn't have as much to do?
Well, definitely, there's always you reap what you sow.
Right, right.
And I also have that handout, if you didn't get a copy last week, it addresses all those questions. They call some of them zombie issues because they keep coming up no matter what. But her point is, and I think it's very appropriate, that you have to have very short sentences. So when someone says, well, it's just the cycle, you can say, no, the sun cycle is at a nadir now, it's at a bottom, we should be cooling off, not heating up. And then you try to engage them as a Christian or as a someone who likes to go hiking or something, because people will stay that way. I mean, they will try to hold on to their issues, and you can't. So you want to move away from those kind of zombie issues as fast as you can. But luckily, she says that 6%, they've done studies, they put them in 6 different categories. The people who are like, I want to make you hurt for bringing that up to me, are only 6%. So that's good.
That's good. I'm reading a different book called Leaders Eat Last, and it's about,
Oh, that's lovely.
yeah, Simon Sinek. Anyway, it's mostly about the workplace, but it could also be about churches. And where people do best is when they feel like there's a circle of safety, like we've got each other's back here. And so, if we pull together as a church and we're trying to all pull in the same direction and we all feel like we're in this together, and that there's some leadership that is not from a fear-based place, but love, people are more effective. People are more willing to work hard, to try things, to take risks.
I think I mentioned that when Al Gore's Truth, what was his movie called?
Inconvenient Truth.
When they brought that to Iowa, it was a huge flop. And then they got smarter and said, they went to the churches and said, this is a stewardship question. We have to take care of the earth. We have to take care of each other. We have to lead the way. And they were able to, and this was 20 years ago, this just blew me away, is they got the farmers to put in windmills. They got people to put solar panels on when they were still really, really expensive. They supplemented. And I was always amazed, and you know this, I was something ridiculous, like 27% now of their electricity comes from alternative sources. she was talking about being in Texas. They're getting 23% of their electricity from alternatives. Said they don't talk about that, but it is just how you approach it. If people in these churches felt we've got to take care of ourselves, take care of God's earth, they sacrificed a lot.
And of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine if all of Port Angeles had that, you know.
I think that's one of the truths of a church, synagogue, or any kind of religion is you do feel stronger as a group.
Yeah, and the other thing is people, when you're doing fundraising or working toward a goal that has some like a measuring stick of any kind, people are more likely to contribute if they see there's already something in the bank.
That's good.
And so, you know, we're already partway, we're already doing this.
There's also a common thread of cost. Oftentimes, industry, for example, will say, well, that's too costly to do those things. And there's a very strong argument that the cost of doing business is going to become exponential because of climate change alone. So your supply chain, you think you're going to be able to keep that? No. These things are in your long-term interest. And so the argument can always be shifted to what's in your interest. Okay, what are you concerned about? Bottom line, great. Right now, you're doing fine. What are you going to be doing in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, so finding that common ground, like you say.
I think interesting, in using a different term, instead of things being green, they're sustainable, which is, I
Right.
think, a term that's become a lot more popular. And I think it's a lot easier to grasp, which is, we're doing something that we can't continue to do, and, you know,
Or
but there are alternatives. We
or
can do
even
the other.
strategic.
Right, yeah,
I mean, this is survival,
yeah, what's your future look like?
right?
If this is gonna continue, which
Yeah,
now it seems pretty apparent, even to the most negative, most deniers, this, things are changing, and if they, so let's just say you're not as smart as you think you are on your own. What's your backup plan now? What do you think is gonna happen if you're wrong? You know, and, not, you know, because
yeah.
I've been wrong lots of times in my life. you know.
How many business managers go down a road without a contingency?
Right, yeah,
Yeah,
look at the alternatives, and maybe,
yeah.
do you really know it costs you more, or have you looked at it? I mean, just getting people to be open, I think, as opposed to, like you said, the guilt, you gotta do this now, and if you don't do this, you're stupid.
Right.
Hang on, no, you can't do that. If you don't do this, you're not smart.
Or I also think that you got to be careful because the urgency could drive you to do policy choices that create backlash, that, for lack of a better word, look stupid in the long run. And that in itself can harm an otherwise well-meant and necessary focus.
So there, you know, these different layers of action to take. There's our personal, and then our small collective, and then things that maybe we can do to influence the big polluters, the gross polluters. In California, they call your car a gross polluter if it doesn't pass the smog thing. My mom had a newish car and it didn't pass the smog thing, and she goes, "Oh, I'm a gross polluter." Anyway, but I mean the macro gross polluter. But you know, like we were talking last week about our furnace replacement need here, and about maybe going with an electric furnace instead of a gas powered thing. And just even that, if the congregation knows that, then that can also have a ripple effect of like, okay, well, you know, at my house, I need to replace something, or, you know, maybe I will look at, the church could do it, so maybe I can do it. You know?
Yeah, I did meet with update. I did meet with a fellow, and he's doing an estimate both ways, but he said that just for furnace, it probably wouldn't be a lot more cost. Probably, you know, I'm guessing just maybe a little more. Might have to run some electrical to handle that wattage.
And chances are, long-term, you're going to save
Oh, and
on
long term,
energy use.
yeah, for sure. So
And is that a regular, I mean, kind of old fashioned electric furnace, or do they have the inverter thing where, I mean, because they got, you know, like the splits, I mean, the big thing on saving energy on those splits that you do by room is that, I mean, it doesn't always operate either all on or all off. I mean, it can operate at low wattage, so it's just running, you know.
You like ductless?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the ductless
yeah,
things.
it's not deckless. It's
Right.
not. So, but it's, you know, it's just I think just a normal regular.
Okay,
furnace.
because the ductless system, I mean, what's saving the energy isn't the fact that it's ductless. I mean,
Right,
it's
right.
the fact that you've got an inverter outside that's actually doing the thing that used to have a compressor do. And so
Is
you
that like a
can,
heat pump?
Yeah, heat pumps.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
he said, he said
But-
a heat pump sort of approach would be twice as much as just an electric furnace.
right. The different kinds of heat pumps, though, is the difference is
Oh.
you're getting one that can adjust to the power input. So you can lower the power input and do it slowly over a period of time. But I mean, for instance, at our house, I mean, because our house is relatively new, I mean, but I mean, we have ductless things upstairs, but our downstairs looks conventional, but it's not. I mean, the thing outside is actually one of these inverter things. So it's way more efficient than your old style heat pump air conditioning type thing would be.
I'll ask him about an inverter.
Yeah,
If there's an inversion sort of piece that.
yeah, you could use it, and it may be more expensive, and I guess the question is it worth it? I mean, they're supposed to be, more energy efficient. I mean, from that standpoint.
Those are kind of like with we have in the office, the ductless deals, and they're on like all the time. I wonder, that's the one thing I wonder for a facility that's used as,
Yeah, and I'm thinking that too.
Yeah, it's not necessarily appropriate for this situation where you are just heating for short periods of time. Yeah, it's long-term where you save the money because you're not going up and down.
Yeah.
There was one thing, the idea of kind of helping raise awareness and stuff that, there's a big push to do like LEED buildings and things, that meet a certain standard. And actually, there's been a lot of pushback on it. And I wish my brother-in-law was here because he's CEO of Sonoma Clean Power. It's a co-op that serve 5 counties in North Bay area, California, with 100% renewable energy. It's like the first of its kind in California. And one of the things he does is he talks he's pushed back against like LEED buildings because there's a lot of cost that goes into that, and you can incorporate these things without getting necessarily the certification kind of deal. Anyway, one of the things that you can do is just building awareness with some of the things that you might like. I don't know if where we are with it. We were talking the other day at Community Life, for instance, that old drinking fountain that we have here, by the bathrooms, that, if we replace that with a water bottle filler type setup, that would get utilized. And then those are the kinds of things that, instead of buying bottled water or whatever, you can go and have filtered water right from the deal there. And having little signs and things that help promote, realize that when you do this, you're saving however many like water bottles or whatever. That's a huge thing. If we have a function here, we get water, the old plastic bottles from Costco or something like that. That's like all that waste.
And we have to do it. I mean, I remember working for General Electric in the 80s, and some very smart man said, we're only doing this because we are robbing it from the poor countries. And we're throwing all those little plastic bottles into the ocean and recycling, 3% or something of them. And we have to give it up. And we can give it up pretty easily because they have those wonderful things now. I think these two things are coming together, and it's magnificent. So, all right, one more. Okay, is that all right with everybody? Sure. All right.
Is this the last one?
The last one for today.
Okay, but there is one more.
This is a really good question, because often people will say, sure, I care about this issue.
Oh, I didn't read the question. Catherine, it goes without saying that these are very trying times we are living through. Some people might suggest that there are more important issues for us to be thinking about right now. So how do we ensure that we care for creation and climate change? We care for creation and climate change remain not only on the agenda, but higher up the agenda. All right, I'll go back 10 seconds.
This is a really good question, because often people will say, sure, I care about this issue, but this isn't the most important issue right now. What I want to do is I want to remind us of that image of the leaky bucket. Do we care about climate change because of itself, because of its impact on 1 or 2 or 3 degree warming in the average temperature of the planet? No, we care about climate change because it affects everything else that we already care about today. The reason we care about climate change is because it is a threat multiplier. So when people say, well, I'm busy worrying about this, all you have to do is just connect the dots, say yes. And this is affected by climate change. And that's why we have to not only fill the bucket, but patch the hole in the bucket too. The solution is not to deny the reality of the problem. And the solution is not to deny the efficacy of the solutions. The solution is to recognize that to care about the health of our planet, the health of the human race, the health of our family, our friends, our loved ones, our community, our country, we only have to be one thing, and that is a human being who lives on this planet. And furthermore, as Christ followers, we already care about people. We have been given a new heart, and that new heart has God's love poured out in it to love others as we ourselves have been loved. So what is the true solution to climate change? It's a solution that will help fix poverty and hunger, lack of access to resources and jobs at the same time. We have to figure out how to get our energy from clean ways, how to stop wasting so much energy, how to alter our behaviors in some ways. But the bottom line, as this cartoon says, which I love, is what if this whole thing is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? What if we end up with energy independence and sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, clean air, water, and healthy children? These are the consequences of acting on climate. The truth is that the planet's health is our health, and climate action is action for the health of the planet and the human race. The coronavirus pandemic has showed us how interrelated they are. Both climate change and the pandemic threaten the health and the safety of our family, our friends, our loved ones, and our communities. Both of them affect the economy, resource availability, national security, and more. Both of them disproportionately affect the sick, the very young and old, the poorest and most vulnerable, both here and abroad. Both of them are threat multipliers. And when it comes down to it, we care about the coronavirus pandemic, we care about climate change, and we care about all of these other issues for exactly the same reasons. We care about them because they affect the people, the things, the places that we love.
So how is climate change affecting the poorest in the world? Can you think of some examples?
People who already live on that margin of barely being able to afford their food when food prices are rising because some areas are already impacted in terms of growing crops by climate change.
Yeah, I watched part of a documentary the other night called The Age of Consequences.
Oh.
And it talked about she said threat multiplier, that's the language that they use. And they talk about climate, issues being these threat multipliers to governments and societies and cultures, that help exacerbate issues that lead to like civil war, military action and things like that, the collapse of economies. So there's some tie-in with, like, for instance, the civil war in Syria having been preceded by a period of drought. And so people are already stressed, they're trying to find, or, how, extremism like ISIS and so on have, kind of find people because they're looking to sustain themselves and their families, and they don't have the food or the money to be able to buy the food or grow their crops and things. So that, the effects of a changing climate then exacerbate all these other issues.
In short, it reduces our resources, so there's less to go around, and it is always those, as you say, on the margin that have the toughest time, and those will be the ones first to lose.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a crop failure someplace, a country like the US, we can just afford to pay a little more to the detriment of people that don't have those resources.
Right.
Also, extremes of temperature and people's just ability to live in a home or dwelling where you can modulate the temperature.
So they're talking about daytime temperatures
No air conditioning.
And also folks on those margins also are more likely to live off the land and the resources that the land produce, and climate change stresses that. It introduces a change greater than those species can adapt to, except for weeds.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
So pigeons, rats, thistles, they'll do just fine.
Cockroaches, yeah.
Horsetails.
Oh, horse tails, yes.
I heard that heat can affect one's mind too. So just personal relationships can change because of the heat.
They used to say that in the inner city especially.
You can measure the violence.
The violence.
Right.
That's
Police
what I'm
calls.
thinking, you know, it's hot and hotter and you're in a tenement or something and you're crowded and there's no air conditioning and barely any windows and just.
Slow to anger is not good.
No. No. Do you see, why is it that Christians can't put the two together? Because you know, this is our top, one of our top edicts is to take care of those weaker than us in poorer circumstances. This is one of the things that we are told we should be doing. And yet people who deny climate change or are reticent to take action, how can we get them to put the two together?
We get to look past. You know, we just tend to be fixed.
No problem.
We just, you know, the first, well, we put Band-Aids on problems, so instead of solutions long-term. So if somebody's hungry, you send them food and, you know, whatever, as opposed to, so you kind of get, you have, I think you have a lot of these in front of your face problems that you try to fix, that some, and this is, you know, it's a harder problem to identify. It's, I think things like this make it more identifiable. And I think as, you know, sadly, as it gets worse, then people say, oh, yeah, I guess maybe it's true, you know, and now how do I address that? But they still kind of trying to put Band-Aids on the results of the problem and trying to fix the, you know, I'm not saying it right, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
We're trying to fix the bleeding instead of, you know, maybe
You're
taking care of
Yeah,
what's
you're treating
causing it.
symptoms and you don't know
Yeah.
the diseases.
Right.
Well, I also think that there is the disinformation cottage industry, for lack of a better word, is something that has to be dealt with also. That, I know it's a whole nother topic, but how do you get truth through that? You know, that it's, to me, that's one of those hugely, I mean, Satan must be chuckling because that's one of those huge problems that, you know, our problems are tough enough to solve with sound minds agreeing and moving ahead in one direction, but with stuff coming at you 90 degrees, we're going, what? You know, it's
Isn't it more than a cottage industry?
it's more than a cottage industry. It's
Yeah,
it's a
I mean,
full-on
huge-
industry,
It's a huge industry,
billions.
and besides disinformation, they're preying on people's selfishness and greed.
Right.
I think.
Right. Well, and I have yet to see a sound response to that. What do you, I mean, you can't regulate it because then we're getting into regulation of information and free speech. But at the same time, there's got to be a way to stand up and say, no, that's wrong.
Well, I think that comes down to individual relationships.
Yeah. And where do you meet these people? You can meet them in church. We isolate ourselves so well. But church is one place maybe we don't have as much isolation, or schools.
There's still some. I mean, this is the choir here that we're preaching to. And there may be a few in our church that aren't there, but not very many.
Do you find that true also in school?
Port Angeles is truly a mirror of our larger society. Like you know, when the way Port Angeles votes is the way the nation, like we're.
Yeah.
And so kids at school are on both sides.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But at least they're within access. I mean, if you
Oh,
felt that you could reach them with respect and disseminate truth as opposed to,
mhm.
because I think you're right, that's the only way we can do this is by talking, because you can't stop the media juggernaut.
Mhm.
Must be really difficult for teachers to deal with that much.
Yeah, and we're really not allowed to espouse our own positions on things.
Well, that was the case when I taught in the '70s too, but I didn't find that to be a problem too much, but today it's different. One of the nieces teaches history in middle grades in a Phoenix suburb, and she's giving it up. I mean, she's going to go to teaching something else next year, just because it's so politically divided. She can't teach anything hardly, but it's either the black parents are upset with what she teaches or what she doesn't teach, or the white parents are upset with what she's teaching or doesn't teach. And so she's quitting, at least quitting history. She can't
Did
afford
anybody
it.
around here, were you bused as a child to school? For integration, I was. Mostly it was the black kids who got bused, of course. But yeah, that's how I grew up. I always thought it was a great idea, because as soon as they stopped doing it, I noticed that I had very few black friends because of just the new milieus I found myself in.
So you were still in school when they stopped doing it? So-
I moved on to college. They were still doing it. They were still doing it when I was in high school.
No. I don't think so.
This was in New Haven, Connecticut too, so they were really into it. So
Mhm.
anyway, I think that it's something that is very important, and I think that we should stop now. And we will not meet next week because of the retreat. And we'll do the last two. And the last two, the titles are "There Can Be a Better Future"
Yay.
and "It's Not Too Late."
Good, good.
So we will leave here with a positive, ready to go. Right? That's what you can in prayer, please. Dear Lord, we ask you to mold us, what we've learned today, to mold around in our heads. Help us form some feelings of progress for the future. Help us come to terms with the idea that we can be your voices to save your planet in a respectful, non-guilty, non-frightening, hopeful way. In your name, amen.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.
you.